A royal nursery falls silent. Its young heirs vanished without a trace. This is the hidden history of the children of conquered kings, a story where the cradle was as strategic as the throne. You will discover the chilling, calculated playbook victors used to control the most vulnerable members of a rival dynasty. We will uncover why a child's survival could threaten an empire and how their forced marriages built new kingdoms. What really happened to the sons and daughters of kings after the battle was lost? The city gates shattered, and the dust had not yet settled before the conqueror's soldiers marched not for the treasury, but for the palace nursery. In that hushed room, the true prize awaited. These children were far more than prisoners. They were living, breathing symbols of a dynasty's past and its potential future, each one a vessel of royal blood that could legitimize or threaten a new regime. To understand their fate, you must first grasp their immense strategic value. A surviving son was a walking, talking claim to the very throne the victor now occupied. A daughter was a key to unlocking a powerful alliance through marriage, binding a rebellious noble house to the new order. They were the ultimate hostages, their lives the guarantee of their families and their people's continued obedience. Historian Dr. Elena Vance explains that in these eras, controlling the bloodline was synonymous with controlling the claim to power. It was a brutal form of insurance. The children of a defeated king could be forced into many roles. Some were raised in the victor's own court, indoctrinated to be loyal puppets. Others were promised in marriage to their conqueror's allies, their royal lineage used to cement new political bonds. A few might even be groomed as future rulers, but only under the strict supervision of their captors. None of these outcomes were accidental. They were the result of cold, calculated statecraft, where a child's life was weighed on a scale of political utility. And this chilling calculation of value leads us directly to the most common and most brutal fate that awaited them. The most direct answer to the threat of a royal child was also the most final. Behind closed doors, in hushed conversations far from public view, the order would be given. This was the path of silent elimination, where a young life was extinguished to secure a throne. Historical whispers tell us of the sons of Constantine XI, the last Byzantine emperor. After the fall of Constantinople, they simply vanished from the record. Their fates a dark mystery many believe was a political necessity for the new Ottoman rulers. Centuries later, in the Tower of London, the two young princes, Edward V and his brother Richard, disappeared. The official story may have been murky, but the effect was crystal clear. Their potential claims to the English crown were erased forever. The justifications for such acts were always carefully crafted. Victors would speak of discovered plots, of necessary actions to prevent future civil war, or of treason that demanded a harsh response. But beneath the public rhetoric lay a raw calculation. The death of a child heir was a message written in blood, a declaration of absolute power meant to terrify any remaining supporters of the old regime into submission. It was state-sponsored terror designed to prove that the new ruler would stop at nothing. This psychological impact was profound, creating a climate of fear that could cement a regime's control for a generation. Yet this brutal, shadowy fate stands in stark contrast to a much more public and symbolic form of control, one that did not end a life but utterly transformed it. Chains of gold did not always lead to a silent cell. For some royal children, a far more public fate awaited, one designed not to hide their existence but to flaunt their utter defeat. Imagine a young prince born to command armies, now forced to walk in shackles through the roaring streets of his enemy's capital. This was the public spectacle of humiliation, a calculated theater of power where the victor sought to destroy not just a person, but a symbol. The goal was to rewrite history in the minds of the watching crowds, transforming a revered heir into a pitiable captive. The ancient Romans perfected this art. In their legendary triumphs, conquering generals paraded through Rome with their spoils of war, and among the most prized living trophies were the sons and daughters of defeated kings. The historian Appian describes the scene, noting how the crowd's cheers were not for the captive children, but for the power that had subdued them. This ritual was a brutal form of communication. For the conquered people watching, it was a devastating lesson, a visual proof that their old gods and old kings had failed them. For the victor's own citizens, it was a potent display of their leader's invincibility, solidifying their loyalty through a shared spectacle of dominance. By stripping these young royals of their dignity in front of thousands, the conqueror drained their bloodline of its perceived magic. The people's memory of a glorious dynasty was overwritten with the indelible image of its heirs in chains. This public degradation was often just the first act in a longer drama, a prelude to a more subtle and enduring form of control that would shape the rest of their lives. But the most enduring form of control was neither death nor a single day of shame. It was a lifetime spent in a gilded cage. Many royal children were taken as permanent political hostages, their lives held as a guarantee of their family's continued loyalty. They resided in luxurious apartments within the victor's own palace, surrounded by every comfort, yet never free to leave. This was a prison disguised as privilege, a life of pampered surveillance where every word and action was monitored. The geopolitical logic was brutally simple. A defeated chieftain or king was far less likely to rebel if his beloved son and heir was living under the constant watch and potential threat of his conqueror. The ancient Romans systematically applied this policy, bringing the sons of Celtic and Germanic chieftains to be raised in Rome. These young men were educated in Roman ways, dressed in Roman clothes, and taught to appreciate Roman power, all while knowing their own safety was the chain that bound their people to obedience. Centuries later, the Ottoman sultans perfected this system within the Topkapi Palace. Younger brothers and sons of the reigning sultan were often confined to a special section of the palace known as the kafes, or the cage. They lived in beautiful, secluded apartments, provided with every luxury, but were cut off from the world and from any political influence. Their existence was one of suspended animation, a life spent waiting for a call to the throne that might never come, or for a silent executioner's visit. For these children, every meal, every gift, every tutor was a reminder that their life was not their own. It was a currency spent to purchase peace, a human pledge for a treaty's endurance. This constant state of being a living bargaining chip forced a profound psychological adaptation, creating an identity crisis that would shape their entire lives. The most insidious fate was one that sought to rewrite a child's very soul. A young prince or princess taken from their homeland would be immersed in a new world designed to systematically erase their past. Their native language was forbidden, their traditional clothes exchanged for foreign styles, and their ancestral gods replaced with the deities of their captors. This was forced assimilation, a long-term strategy of psychological conquest aimed at transforming a potential threat into a loyal asset. The process was methodical and thorough. Religious conversion was often the first step, a public renunciation of the old faith that severed the child's spiritual connection to their people. Next came cultural indoctrination. They were educated exclusively in the history, laws, and customs of the conquering power, taught to see their own heritage as backward or barbaric. In some cases, young princes were even placed in the victor's military, trained to fight for the very empire that had destroyed their family's kingdom. Colonial empires later perfected this model. The children of African chiefs or Indian maharajas were frequently sent to European boarding schools. There, they were civilized out of their identity, learning to speak French or English with perfect fluency while their own traditions were mocked and suppressed. The goal was clear: to create a pliable local ruler who would govern on behalf of the distant empire, a person who internally identified more with their captors than with their own subjects. This created individuals perpetually caught between two worlds. They were never fully accepted by the conquerors, who always saw the shadow of their royal blood, yet they were now alienated from the people they were born to lead. Their entire identity became a political tool, a living monument to the power of cultural erasure, and this profound reshaping of a person laid the foundation for the most intimate and calculated use of all, the strategic marriage. A grand wedding ceremony could be the most sophisticated prison a royal child ever knew. The silk gowns, the public vows, the merging of two bloodlines all masked a profound political transaction. For the daughters of conquered kings, marriage was rarely a matter of the heart. It was a carefully orchestrated strategy of alliance, a way for the victor to absorb the legitimacy of the old dynasty while neutralizing its threat. By marrying the son or daughter of a defeated rival, the conqueror wove their family's story directly into the fabric of the new regime. This union served two powerful purposes. First, it infused the victor's bloodline with the sacred royal blood of the conquered, granting their heirs a powerful claim to legitimacy in the eyes of the defeated population. Second, it created a web of familial obligation. How could a father raise his sword against the grandfather of his own grandchildren? This bond of blood was intended to be a stronger chain than any iron, discouraging rebellion for generations to come. In Tudor England, Henry VIII was a master of this practice. After defeating and executing powerful nobles who challenged his rule, he would often arrange marriages between their children and his own loyal supporters. These unions were not acts of forgiveness, but acts of consolidation, designed to bind the surviving heirs of rebellious houses directly to the crown's interests. The children in these marriages lived complex lives. A princess might find herself the queen of the very nation that destroyed her homeland, forced to navigate a court filled with her family's enemies. Her children would carry the blood of both conqueror and conquered, a living embodiment of a forced peace. While some of these arranged unions grew into genuine partnerships, many were lifelong performances of political duty, where the personal desires of the child were entirely irrelevant to the grand design of statecraft. A child's world is built on foundations of family and home, and for these royal children, that world was shattered in an instant. One day you are a prince, heir to a kingdom, surrounded by servants and the love of your parents. The next you are a pawn, your parents are dead or imprisoned, and the familiar walls of your palace have become the borders of your prison. The trauma of that displacement was absolute. It was not just a change of scenery, it was the violent theft of their entire identity. They were plunged into a state of constant, low-grade fear, a hyper-vigilance where a sudden footstep outside their door or a change in their guard's demeanor could signal a death sentence. Modern psychology would recognize this as a recipe for complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Their captivity was not a single traumatic event, but a continuous, inescapable environment of threat, where their captors held the power of life and death. The very people who provided their food and education were also the ones who had destroyed their families. This created an impossible psychological conflict, a forced dependency on their oppressors that twisted their sense of loyalty and self. Who could they trust in a world where a kind word might be a manipulation and a harsh lesson a veiled threat? Their identity became a battleground, Were they the proud heir of a conquered people or the dutiful ward of a powerful emperor? To survive, many had to suppress their true memories and emotions, constructing a false persona to please their captors. This internal fracture could lead to a lifelong struggle with chronic anxiety, deep depression, and a profound sense of alienation from everyone around them. Consider the mental weight of knowing your continued existence depends entirely on your political usefulness. How does that constant calculation shape a young mind? What kind of adult emerges from a childhood where love is conditional and safety is an illusion? This human cost, the silent suffering behind the grand political strategies, forces us to look beyond the chessboard of power and see the broken pieces left behind. Yet from this crucible of suffering, a remarkable few did not just break, they were forged into something entirely new. The Tower of London in the summer of 1483 was a place of stifling suspense. Two boys, the 12-year-old King Edward V and his 9-year-old brother Richard, were lodged within its walls. They had been placed there for their own protection by their uncle, the Lord Protector, who was preparing for Edward's coronation. But the coronation never came. Instead, their uncle declared the boys illegitimate and had himself crowned King Richard III, and then the princes simply vanished from public view. Their disappearance became the coldest case in English history, a perfect, haunting illustration of how a rival bloodline could be erased. The contemporary sources are few and deeply partisan. Sir Thomas More, writing decades later, penned a detailed account that pinned the murders on Richard III, describing the boys being smothered in their beds. But More was a Tudor propagandist, and his story served the new dynasty that had defeated Richard. The other main source comes from the Italian chronicler Dominic Mancini, who was in London at the time and reported only that the boys were being seen less and less, and then not at all. He heard rumors of their deaths but had no proof. The political motivation for their elimination was overwhelming. As long as the Plantagenet princes lived, they were a focal point for rebellion. Their very existence threatened the security of Richard's hastily seized throne. By removing them, he could, in one brutal act, secure his own line. Yet the enduring power of this mystery lies in the competing theories that have flourished for centuries. Was it Richard III, the classic villain of Shakespeare's play? Or could the culprit have been Henry VII, the Tudor king who defeated Richard and had an equally strong motive to eliminate any Plantagenet claimants to his new throne? Some even spun tales of secret survival, that the younger prince escaped to live in obscurity, a story that later inspired pretenders to challenge the Tudor crown. This legacy of uncertainty is the final, brilliant stroke of this kind of political strategy. The fates of these children became a weapon long after the fact. For the Tudors, the lingering doubt about Richard's guilt was a powerful tool to blacken the name of the previous regime and justify their own rule. The mystery itself became a form of control, a shadow over the past that served the present. The story of the princes in the tower captivates us not just because of the crime, but because of the silence that followed. It shows how the complete erasure of a royal child could be as effective as their very public subjugation, leaving behind a void filled with suspicion and propaganda that could shape a nation's story for generations. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not the end of the Aztec royal line, but the beginning of its transformation. Moctezuma II left behind a legacy not just in stone and story, but in flesh and blood through his many children. Their world had been utterly shattered by conquest, and now they became central pieces in Spain's project to build a new society upon the ruins of the old. Their fates were not uniform, but a spectrum of calculated political moves. demonstrating how old-world strategies of dynastic control were applied with brutal efficiency in the New World. Perhaps the most famous of these children was his daughter Tekuichpatsin, who would be baptized as Isabel Moctezuma. She was a princess who held immense symbolic value in her veins. The Spanish recognized that her royal blood was the key to legitimizing their rule and their claims to her father's vast lands and the loyalty of his people. To secure this, she was married not once but 5 times, each union a strategic step in the consolidation of Spanish power. Her first marriages were to Aztec nobles, attempts by the collapsing empire to maintain its own lineage. But her later marriages were all to Spanish conquistadors, binding her and the legitimacy she represented directly to the new ruling class. Through these unions, she became one of the richest women in New Spain. Her encomienda, a grant of native labor, a clear reward for her cooperation and a tool for her assimilation. Her life was a gilded cage, a performance of conversion and compliance that secured her survival and position in the new order. But what of Moctezuma's other children? Their stories are less documented but equally revealing. Another daughter, Leonor Moctezuma, was also given in marriage to a conquistador, and her descendants would weave the blood of the Aztec emperor into the emerging Spanish colonial aristocracy. Sons like Pedro Moctezuma were baptized and integrated, their very presence in Spanish society serving to demystify and domesticate the old regime. Conversion to Catholicism was the non-negotiable first step for all of them, a spiritual conquest that mirrored the military one. They were taught Spanish, dressed in European clothes, and made to adopt new customs, a systematic effort to erase their Aztec identities and remake them as loyal subjects of the Spanish crown. This was not merely personal salvation, it was political theater, designed to show the defeated population that even their semi-divine royal family had accepted the new god and the new masters. The children of Moctezuma thus became foundational figures in the creation of Mestizo Mexico, a society born from the violent fusion of two worlds. They were living, breathing instruments of colonial policy, their lives a complex legacy of survival, collaboration, and profound cultural loss. Their existence forced a question that would echo for centuries: where does true power reside, in the sword that conquers, or in the bloodline that endures and transforms? A prince and a princess, born of the same royal blood, could face futures as different as a sword and a wedding veil. In the cold calculus of conquest, gender was a primary factor in determining whether a child was seen as a problem to be solved or an opportunity to be seized. Sons embodied the most direct and enduring threat. They were the living continuation of a dynasty's name, its claim to power, and its potential for future vengeance. This made them walking liabilities. A daughter, however, presented a different kind of value. She carried the same prestigious bloodline, but within the patriarchal frameworks of most ancient and medieval societies, she was not typically a claimant to the throne herself. Instead, her lineage became a transferable asset, a key to unlocking alliances and legitimizing a new ruling house. Her perceived utility, therefore, often became her shield. This stark divergence in fate can be traced across continents and eras. In the Mongol Empire, the sons of defeated rulers were frequently executed to prevent future challenges, a practice Genghis Khan employed with brutal consistency. Yet his armies carefully collected the daughters of conquered kings, marrying them to his own sons and generals. These women were used to weave the Mongols into the very fabric of the empires they subjugated, their children inheriting a hybrid legitimacy. Similarly, in medieval Europe, the fate of the last Anglo-Saxon royal family after the Norman conquest of 1066 is telling. Edgar the Aetheling, the young male heir, was a persistent focus of rebellion and was constantly watched, his life in perpetual danger. His sisters, Margaret and Christina, however, were treated very differently. They were eventually allowed to travel to Scotland, where Margaret famously married King Malcolm III, cementing an alliance and ensuring the survival of their royal blood through a new, safer line. The underlying logic was brutally pragmatic. A prince could raise an army, a princess could bear a child who might one day rule. One represented a military threat, the other a diplomatic opportunity. This gendered strategy was a cornerstone of dynastic politics, revealing that for the children of conquered kings, survival was not merely a matter of chance, but a function of their perceived use within a conqueror's long-term plans. Their bodies and their blood became a currency, with the exchange rate set by the rigid rules of patriarchy. This relentless focus on utility leads us to a final, haunting question, one that echoes from the silent nurseries of history into our own understanding of power itself. A royal baptism was never just about saving a soul. It was a public spectacle of political submission, where holy water washed away not only sin but an entire heritage. Forcing a conquered royal child to convert was one of the most profound acts of domination, a deliberate strike at the spiritual heart of the dynasty they represented. When a young prince renounced the gods of his ancestors, he was not merely adopting a new faith, he was performing a ritual that declared his old gods powerless, his old ways defeated. This severed the sacred bond between the ruling family and the divine forces the people believed protected their kingdom. The conqueror's god had proven stronger, and the child's conversion was the living proof. This strategy was employed with chilling effectiveness across the medieval world. In Europe, as pagan tribes were subdued by Christian kingdoms, the baptism of a chieftain's son was a non-negotiable term of surrender. The child would be taken to the victor's court, often given a new Christian name, and immersed in church doctrine. His conversion served as a template for his entire people, a signal that their old beliefs were obsolete and that their future lay in embracing the faith of their conquerors. Similarly, as the Islamic caliphates expanded, they often demanded the conversion of the ruling families of conquered territories. A Muslim prince raised in the caliph's court could later be sent back to govern his homeland as a loyal vassal, his spiritual allegiance ensuring his political loyalty to the empire. The goal was to create a fundamental psychological shift. By dismantling the child's original religious framework, the captors aimed to rewire their very sense of identity and purpose. A prince who once believed his right to rule was granted by the god Odin or Perun would now be taught that his survival and any future authority flowed from the Christian god or Allah, and by extension from the Christian or Muslim king who embodied that faith on earth. His primary allegiance was systematically transferred. This process rarely happened in isolation. It was the companion to cultural erasure, with the child's native language, dress, and customs being suppressed simultaneously. The message was unified and brutal: your old world is dead, and your value now lies in how well you adapt to the new one. The child's soul became the ultimate battleground, and their conversion was the final surrender. A royal bloodline is a river, not a pond, and its currents can flow for centuries. The decision to spare a child, to marry a princess, or to execute a prince was never just about securing a throne for one lifetime. It was a gamble on the future, a move whose consequences would unfold across generations. When a victor chose to absorb a rival dynasty through marriage, they were not merely securing an alliance, they were introducing a new and potent claim into their own family's bloodstream. That dormant claim could sleep for decades, only to be awakened by an ambitious noble or a weak monarch, igniting a war of inheritance that the original conqueror never could have foreseen. The blood of the conquered, flowing through the veins of the conqueror's own grandchildren, could become the very justification for rebellion. Consider the long shadow of the Norman conquest of England. William the Conqueror defeated and killed the Anglo-Saxon King Harold, but he did not systematically exterminate the entire old royal house. Remnants of the Anglo-Saxon bloodline survived, and decades later, this lineage became a powerful rallying cry for rebels opposing Norman rule. The conquered blood became a symbol of legitimate English identity, used to challenge the descendants of the very man who had spilled it. Conversely, the complete and utter eradication of a royal house could create a different kind of problem, a power vacuum. When a dynasty was wiped out with no clear heir, the resulting scramble for the empty throne could plunge a region into decades of civil war, as rival noble families fought for a prize that no single bloodline could clearly claim. This happened repeatedly in medieval Eastern Europe, where the extinction of a ruling house often invited invasion from neighboring kingdoms, each asserting their own distant or fabricated genealogical link. The fate of a single child, therefore, was a seed planted in the soil of history. It could grow into a vine that strangled the conqueror's legacy, or it could become a graft that strengthened the tree, creating a hybrid dynasty more resilient than either of its parts. The story does not end with the captivity or the marriage, it merely changes stage. The true legacy of these children was written in the wars, treaties, and royal births of the centuries that followed, a reminder that in the calculus of power, even the most carefully laid plans could be undone by the very blood they sought to control. Amidst the clash of swords, another battle was waged in the minds of scholars and theologians. The systematic destruction or manipulation of royal children did not go entirely unquestioned, even in eras we often label as purely brutal. While realpolitik often dictated the most ruthless course, a quiet, persistent debate simmered about the lines a civilized power should not cross. In the philosophical courts of the ancient world, voices occasionally rose to challenge the absolute logic of state necessity. The Roman philosopher Seneca, for instance, wrestled with the ethics of anger and excessive punishment, arguing that a ruler's greatness was demonstrated by his mercy toward the vanquished, not just his power to destroy them. This was not a mainstream view that stopped executions, but it established an intellectual counterpoint, a vocabulary of conscience that could be invoked. Religious texts, too, provided complicated guidance. The Bible contained stories of divinely sanctioned destruction of rival lineages, yet it also preached compassion for the orphan and the stranger. This created a moral tension that medieval kings had to navigate, sometimes performing public acts of penance after particularly bloody successions to atone for the sins of political necessity. The most famous articulation of this conflict came from Renaissance Italy. Niccolò Machiavelli, in his seminal work The Prince, cut through the moralizing with cold, pragmatic clarity. For a new ruler, he argued, it is far safer to be feared than loved. He advised that if you must injure a man, you should do it in such a way that you remove his ability to strike back, a logic that could easily be extended to eliminating a rival's heirs. Machiavelli's genius was in writing down the quiet calculations that had always guided power, framing mercy not as a virtue but as a potential strategic weakness. Yet this very pragmatism provoked a counter-movement. Philosophers like Erasmus argued for Christian peace and the humane treatment of all, ideas that slowly seeped into the diplomatic language of Europe. These were not yet human rights as we understand them, but they were the beginning of a framework that questioned whether a state's security truly demanded the absolute sacrifice of a child's life. The existence of these debates is crucial. It tells us that the people of these eras were not monolithic in their thinking. A king giving the order to secure his throne might still feel the weight of his soul, or at least the judgment of his chroniclers. This historical tension forces us to refine our own interpretations. Do we condemn these actions by our modern standards, or do we try to understand them within their own complex moral universe, where the survival of an entire kingdom was often seen as worth any single life? The Silence from the Nursery is not just a story of power, but also a story of the conscience that power struggles to ignore. A Victor's Chronicle is a beautiful tapestry woven with deliberate silences. To uncover the true fate of these royal children, we must learn to read between the lines of official histories, often written to glorify the conqueror and justify their actions. These accounts are not neutral reports, they are instruments of power designed to shape the narrative for generations. A chronicler paid by a new king might record that a rival prince died of a sudden fever, a convenient and blameless end that erases any hint of foul play. The complete disappearance of a child from all records is itself a deafening clue, a silence that speaks volumes about a fate too politically sensitive to ever be written down. This is why historians become detectives, turning to other forms of evidence to challenge the official story. The cold, hard truth can sometimes be found in the earth itself. The potential discovery of the skeletal remains of the two young princes in the Tower of London, for instance, could one day rewrite history. Forensic archaeology can analyze bones for signs of trauma, determine age and sex, and even extract ancient DNA, offering physical proof to confront centuries of rumor and propaganda. But such clear evidence is incredibly rare. More often, the trail is made of paper, not bone. A legal document granting lands or a title to the surviving daughter of a defeated king is not just a property record, it is a map of political strategy. It tells us she was kept alive, rewarded for her compliance, and woven into the fabric of the new regime. Records of a pension paid to a dowager queen or a captured prince reveal a life spared but meticulously controlled. Their comfort a calculated expense on the royal ledger to ensure their continued good behavior. A sudden, generous grant of estates to a loyal courtier might coincide perfectly with his marriage to a conquered princess, the land serving as her price tag in a political merger. This fragmentary evidence is a puzzle missing most of its pieces. Each charter, each bone fragment, each omission in a chronicle is a single point of light in a vast darkness. Connecting them requires cautious interpretation, always aware that we are seeing a ghostly imprint of the past, shaped by the hands of the powerful who had every reason to hide the truth. This inherent uncertainty, this struggle to find the human story beneath the layers of spin and silence, resonates powerfully with how we understand the fate of vulnerable children in the shadow of conflict even today. The echoes of this ancient playbook resonate in the steel and concrete of the modern world. While crowns have largely been replaced by constitutions, the fundamental strategies for neutralizing a rival's legacy remain hauntingly familiar. Consider the wave of monarchies abolished in the 20th century. When a king was deposed, his entire family was often forced into immediate exile, their removal from the national stage a necessary step to solidify the new republic. This was not merely a change of government, it was a calculated act of erasure, designed to strip the old dynasty of its platform and prevent their children from becoming living symbols for a restoration movement. The neutralization was psychological, cutting the royal family off from their people and their history, rendering them powerless ghosts in a foreign land. This pattern extends beyond fallen royalty to modern authoritarian states. The families of political rivals or deposed leaders are frequently placed under house arrest, their lives held as a guarantee of the dissident's silence or as leverage in a high-stakes negotiation. Their comfortable apartments become gilded cages, mirroring the luxurious prisons of the Topkapi Palace, where every phone call is monitored and every visitor is screened. The goal is the same: to control a potential threat not through brute force alone, but through the insidious, constant pressure on those they love most. Propaganda, the modern equivalent of the victor's chronicle, then swings into action. State-controlled media might paint the exiled family as corrupt decadents or the imprisoned children as being protected from a harmful parent's influence. The narrative is carefully managed to justify the control and to sever any public sympathy, transforming human beings into political abstractions. So we must ask ourselves, when we see news reports of a dissident son barred from leaving a country, or a former dictator's grandchildren growing up in secluded exile, are we witnessing a new phenomenon? Or are we seeing the same old dynastic logic playing out in a contemporary key, where bloodlines are still managed as assets and liabilities in the relentless pursuit of power? This hidden history is not so hidden after all. It is a recurring story written in the silent spaces of our own headlines. The tragedy of a royal child is a story too powerful to be left to historians alone. It is on the stage and the canvas that these figures truly come to life, their plights shaped and often simplified into the myths we remember. William Shakespeare, the great playwright, did not merely document the princes in the Tower. He immortalized them as pure, angelic innocents, and their uncle Richard III as a monstrous hunchback, a caricature of villainy that has defined the king in the popular imagination for centuries. Shakespeare was not writing neutral history. He was crafting a narrative for his Tudor patrons, a story where the defeat of such an obvious monster justified their own rule. The complex political realities of the Wars of the Roses were distilled into a stark moral fable of good children and an evil usurper. This sentimental framing became a template. In France, the lost dauphin Louis XVII, who died in prison after the French Revolution, became the subject of countless romantic stories and false claimants. These tales transformed a sickly boy who perished from neglect into a symbol of martyred monarchy, a vessel for royalist nostalgia and anxiety about a world turned upside down. Artists and authors filled the historical silence with pathos, giving the public a grieving narrative that was easier to digest than the grim, ambiguous truth. These cultural representations always serve a purpose. A painting of a young princess in chains is rarely just a portrait. It is a political argument about tyranny. A novel about a hidden heir surviving against all odds taps into our deepest desires for justice and restoration, but this creative license comes at a cost. The messy, nuanced realities of statecraft and the complicated psychology of the children themselves are often sanded away, replaced by archetypes. The vulnerable child becomes a universal symbol, their specific historical context fading behind the powerful emotions they evoke. This cultural afterlife is their final captivity, a prison of perception where they are forever frozen as innocent victims or romanticized ghosts, their true selves forever lost to the demands of a good story. Royal blood was not merely a metaphor, it was a form of political magic. The absolute power of kings was rooted in the profound belief that the right to rule was a heritable quality, a sacred substance passed down through a single, unbroken family line. This was the bedrock principle of legitimacy, and it is why a 6-year-old prince in a cell could be more threatening to a conqueror than a disarmed army in the field. That child was not just a person, he was a living vessel of sovereignty. His continued existence broadcast a silent, destabilizing message to the population that the true, God-given line of kings still lived, and the powerful man on the throne was merely a temporary occupier. Across the globe, cultures developed their own intricate systems to explain and enforce this divine connection. In ancient China, the ruling dynasty held the mandate of heaven. This was not a permanent grant of power, but a conditional one. A dynasty ruled only so long as it governed with virtue and competence. Natural disasters, famines, or invasions were interpreted as signs that the mandate had been withdrawn, that heaven itself had revoked the dynasty's legitimacy. Yet even then, the old royal bloodline retained a potent allure. A victorious rebel who founded a new dynasty would often go to great lengths to claim some connection, however tenuous, to a previous revered line, because that ancient blood still carried the scent of heaven's favor. On the other side of the world, in Europe, kings were anointed with holy oil in ceremonies that mirrored the ordination of priests. This was not a simple coronation, it was a sacrament. The monarch was transformed into a sacred being, a lieutenant of God on earth. His blood was therefore not ordinary blood, it was touched by the divine. This concept of the king's two bodies, his mortal physical form and his eternal political authority, meant that while a king could die, the royal dignity flowing in his heirs was immortal. This is the crucial context that makes every strategy we have explored so far make sense. The public humiliation, the gilded cage, the forced marriage, the silent disappearance, none of these were random acts of cruelty. They were each a deliberate, calculated response to the problem of this lingering legitimacy. A conqueror could not simply ignore the children of the old line because the people, on some deep, almost subconscious level, still believed in the magic of the blood. The victor had to actively manage that symbolic power. He had to break it, bury it, or, most cleverly of all, absorb it into his own lineage. Every decision was a negotiation with a phantom, the ghost of a divine right that refused to die with the king who held it. Yet history is not a story written only by victors. In the shadows of those gilded cages, a handful of royal children refused the scripts handed to them. Their stories are the electrifying exceptions, the moments when the pawns on the political chessboard suddenly came to life and overturned the game. These were the individuals who escaped their luxurious prisons, reclaimed their stolen thrones, and led rebellions against the very empires that sought to control them. One of the most dramatic examples comes from the waning days of the Roman Republic. Jugurtha was a Numidian prince, a grandson of the king, who was sent to Rome as a young man to serve as a political hostage. He was immersed in Roman culture and military tactics, a classic case of assimilation designed to create a pliable future ally. But Jugurtha was a brilliant and ambitious student. He learned everything his captors could teach him about war, politics, and most importantly, Roman corruption. He observed how the Senate could be manipulated with bribes and promises. When he returned to Numidia, he did not return as a loyal puppet. He used his Roman education and his intimate knowledge of his enemies' weaknesses to seize the throne and wage a grueling, years-long war against the Roman legions themselves. He became a living nightmare for the Republic, the perfect hostage who had turned his captivity into a masterclass on how to fight back. His success, however, depended on a perfect storm of circumstances. The Roman state was distracted and internally divided. Its oversight of client kingdoms had grown lax. Jugurtha's own formidable charisma allowed him to unite fractious tribes behind him. He had the audacity to see his captors not as invincible gods but as fallible men. Another tale of stunning reversal comes from medieval Wales. Griffith ap Cynan was a prince with a strong claim to the kingdom of Gwynedd. As a young man, he was captured and imprisoned by his rivals for years. His jailers likely believed they had neutralized the threat, that the fire of his ambition would be extinguished by the slow passage of time in a cell. But Griffith did not break. He meticulously planned his escape, eventually breaking free and fleeing to Ireland. There, he gathered a band of loyal followers and Viking mercenaries, crossing the sea to launch a daring invasion. He fought a long and bloody campaign, not just to win his kingdom back, but to hold it, founding a dynasty that would rule for generations. His story is a testament to the sheer, unyielding force of personality. What separates a Griffith from the countless princes who faded away in captivity? Often, it was a critical crack in the conqueror's system. A sudden civil war or a foreign invasion could divert attention and resources, creating a window of opportunity. External support was also crucial, whether from rival powers eager to cause trouble or from disgruntled factions within the conqueror's own borders who saw the royal hostage as a useful weapon. And at the heart of every one of these stories is an individual whose will to power proved stronger than their will to simply survive. These are not just thrilling stories of underdog triumph. They are powerful counter-narratives that puncture the myth of total control. They prove that even the most sophisticated systems of domination could be broken by human resilience, cunning, and an unwavering refusal to accept a assigned fate. For every conqueror who slept soundly believing a rival bloodline was safely managed, there was the lingering fear that a child in a cage was, in fact, a seed of rebellion waiting for the right moment to sprout. A royal hostage required a line item in the royal budget. Behind the political maneuvering and grand strategies lay a cold, practical reality, the meticulous accounting of a captive's cost. Ledgers and inventories from ancient treasuries reveal the economic dimensions of their fate, where a child's life was measured in grain, wine, and the wages of their guards. The expense of maintaining a prince in a gilded cage was not a frivolity. It was a calculated investment in state security, a recurring charge for peace. Every meal served, every tutor hired, every bolt of silk for a new gown was a transaction, a price paid to keep a bloodline quiet and compliant. In the Ottoman Empire, detailed records from the Topkapi Palace accounting offices show the substantial allowances paid for the upkeep of princes confined to the caves. Their food, clothing, and servants were all provided for at a specific, documented cost, a permanent drain on the treasury deemed necessary to prevent civil war. This was not generosity, it was a form of controlled expenditure, a way to manage a human asset without ever setting it free. Conversely, the victor could turn this financial burden into a weapon. A defeated kingdom might be forced to pay for the upkeep of its own captive royal family, a continuous economic drain that crippled its ability to recover and finance rebellion. The royal children became a financial instrument of control, their very sustenance funded by the people they once ruled, a constant reminder of their subjugation. But the most significant economic transactions were reserved for the marriage altar. A strategic union was never just a blending of bloodlines, it was a massive transfer of wealth. The dowry of a conquered princess could be staggering, comprising vast tracts of land, castles, and annual payments of gold. When the Spanish married Isabel Moctezuma to conquistadors, they were not just granting her royal legitimacy, they were transferring the economic rights to her father's former domains, the encomiendas that granted control over native labor and tribute. This was a triple victory. It secured political loyalty, absorbed the old dynasty's legitimacy, and funneled its remaining wealth directly into the pockets of the new ruling class. These grants were carefully recorded in legal charters, which survive as stark financial statements of political mergers. The fate of these children was thus a matter of fiscal policy. A king and his treasurer would weigh the cost of a permanent hostage against the risk of his escape, or calculate the return on investment from a princess's dowry versus the expense of her upbringing. Their lives were entries in a ledger, their value quantified in cold, hard currency, adding a deeply pragmatic layer to the already complex story of their captivity. The guard at your door brings your meals, but you can never be sure if he is your protector or your executioner. For a royal child in captivity, the people tasked with their care existed in a deeply ambiguous space. They were the constant human presence in a life defined by isolation, and their motives were often as veiled as the politics that placed them there. A tutor could be a genuine mentor or a subtle agent of indoctrination. A servant might offer a moment of kindness or report every whispered word back to the throne. The loyalty of these guardians was a currency that everyone sought to control. In some cases, a caretaker's hidden allegiance to the old dynasty could become the child's only lifeline to their heritage. There are whispers of loyal nurses who secretly taught a young prince the language of his conquered homeland, or who kept alive the stories of his true family, planting a seed of rebellion in a mind meant to be pacified. This secret nurturing created a dangerous double life for the child, forcing them to perform loyalty to their captors while privately clinging to an identity they were supposed to forget. Conversely, a guardian chosen for their unwavering loyalty to the conqueror could become the most effective tool of assimilation. By building a bond of trust and dependency, they could slowly, gently rewire the child's sense of self. A kind and respected tutor who spoke only of the new regime's greatness, its just laws, and its glorious future could make the child's old life seem distant and barbaric. This was psychological warfare waged with a soft voice and a reassuring smile, and it was often far more effective than any threat. The case of James I of England is a fascinating example of this duality. As a boy, he was held by various Scottish nobles who were officially his regents and guardians. These men were supposed to guide and protect the young king, yet their true allegiance was to their own power. They used their custody of James to control the government, and he grew up surrounded by plots and shifting alliances, learning firsthand that even those closest to him could not be trusted. This childhood experience of being a pawn in the hands of his caretakers profoundly shaped him into a deeply cautious and politically shrewd adult. These daily interactions in the schoolroom and the royal apartment were where grand strategy met gritty reality. A child's fate could hinge on whether the servant dressing them in the morning felt a pang of pity or a duty to report a rebellious glance. The entire system of control relied on these human intermediaries, individuals with their own ambitions, fears, and occasional acts of conscience. It reminds us that behind every cold political calculation, there was a room, a meal, and a face, and that the most enduring prisons are often built not of stone but of complicated relationships. The logic of power might be universal, but its rituals are not. Across the vast expanse of Eurasia, empires facing the same dilemma: what to do with a rival's children crafted answers that reflected their deepest beliefs about authority, family, and the state. In the sprawling domains of imperial China, the solution was often one of elegant absorption. A defeated prince from a conquered kingdom might be granted a noble title and a comfortable estate, a practice known as enfeoffment. He would be given a ceremonial role, a generous stipend, and allowed to live out his days in peace, but always far from the levers of real power and under the watchful eye of the imperial court. This was not seen as weakness, but as a demonstration of the emperor's supreme virtue and confidence. By enveloping the old dynasty in a web of honorary titles and controlled luxury, the new regime showcased its own magnanimity and the completeness of its victory. The mandate of heaven had passed, and the old line was now a decorative relic, its teeth safely pulled. This approach was rooted in a Confucian worldview that valued social harmony and hierarchical order above outright obliteration. Contrast this with the stark pragmatism of the Ottoman Empire. Here, the principle of state survival was distilled into a single, chilling decree, the law of fratricide. Upon a sultan's ascension, it was considered not just permissible but a solemn duty. for him to order the execution of his younger brothers. This preemptive strike was designed to eliminate any potential for civil war, a clear and brutal calculation that one family tragedy was preferable to a national catastrophe that could claim thousands of lives. The logic was coldly mathematical. The life of a few princes weighed against the stability of an entire empire. While this practice was later softened with the adoption of the cafe system, where brothers were imprisoned instead of killed, the underlying philosophy remained. The state was an entity that transcended any single individual's life, even that of a royal son. So why such a dramatic divergence? The answer lies in the architecture of power itself. In China, the emperor's authority was theoretically absolute and divinely ordained, leaving little room for a rival claim to gain traction if the symbol of the old dynasty was publicly neutralized and pensioned off. In the Ottoman system, however, power was more fluid, contested among multiple male heirs, each with their own factions and armies. Fratricide was the brutal mechanism to short-circuit this inherent instability. One culture sought to publicly display its power through an act of calculated mercy, the other through an act of terrifying necessity. Both, however, were answering the same fundamental question with tools forged in the fires of their own unique histories, proving that the cradle of a conquered king could be a stage for either a pageant or a slaughter. The silent threat of a rival heir forced monarchies to build legal fortresses around their thrones. Over generations, the recurring nightmare of a conquered king's son returning to claim his birthright pushed states to move beyond brute force and into the realm of codified law. The messy, bloody disputes over succession, so often ignited by the lingering claim of a defeated dynasty, became the primary engine for the development of more rigid and formal systems of inheritance. The most famous of these was primogeniture, the clear rule that the crown must pass to the monarch's eldest son. This was not merely tradition, it was a deliberate legal strategy designed to slam the door shut on ambiguity. By establishing one single, undisputed heir from the moment of his birth, a king could hope to starve potential rivals of the oxygen of legitimacy, making it far harder for a challenger from an old, conquered house to find support. But what about those rival claimants who already existed? The law evolved to address them directly. Mechanisms were created to explicitly bar certain individuals from ever wearing the crown. These rules of exclusion or incapacitating laws targeted people based on the circumstances of their birth or their family's political status. A child born to a king after his deposition might be declared legally incapable of inheriting, their very existence rendered a non-issue by statute. In other cases, marrying without the reigning monarch's consent could be deemed an act of treason that disqualified not only the prince who married, but his future children as well, effectively pruning a dangerous branch from the royal family tree before it could grow. This legal innovation extended to the very definition of treason itself, speaking of a rival claimant's right to the throne, or even questioning the legitimacy of the current dynasty, was gradually codified as a capital crime. This transformed a political opinion into a legally punishable act, giving the state a powerful tool to silence the whispers that always swirled around a captive prince or an exiled princess. The office of the regent, the person who governs for a child king, was also shaped by these fears. Elaborate rules were established to prevent a powerful noble from using their control over a young sovereign to marry into a rival line or otherwise manipulate the succession. The entire constitutional structure of monarchy, with its intricate web of laws governing who could rule and under what circumstances, was forged in the fire of these repeated succession crises. The ghost at the feast, the child in the tower, did not just haunt the dreams of kings, they actively shaped the legal architecture of power for centuries to come. A historical vacuum is a powerful storyteller. when a royal heir vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a silent throne and a grieving people, folklore rushed in to provide the answers that history would not. The unresolved fates of these children became fertile ground for some of history's most enduring myths and legends, transforming political tragedies into epic narratives of hope. Across Europe, a powerful archetype emerged: the sleeping king. In England, the legend whispered that King Arthur was not dead, but merely sleeping in a hidden cave, waiting for the nation's greatest hour of need to return and lead his people. In Germany, the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa was said to be slumbering under a mountain, his red beard growing through the stone table, destined to awake when the ravens ceased to fly around the peak. These stories were not mere fairy tales. They served a profound psychological function for populations living under foreign or unpopular rule. The idea that a true, legitimate king was waiting in the wings provided a powerful counter-narrative to the conqueror's story, a secret hope that the current order was only temporary. This myth-making extended beyond kings to their children. The most spectacular example is the legend of Prester John, a fabled Christian king ruling a vast, lost kingdom in the East. This myth is believed by some scholars to have been inspired by the real migrations and disappearances of Nestorian Christian communities, and perhaps even by the distant, garbled stories of Mongol princes who had converted to Christianity. For a medieval Europe feeling besieged by Islamic powers, the story of Prester John was a geopolitical fantasy, a promise of a powerful ally who would one day arrive and turn the tide. The missing royal child became a vessel for collective longing. A princess who disappeared might be reimagined as a fairy queen living in an enchanted forest. A prince who was executed was said to have been spirited away by loyal knights to be raised in secret, his royal birthmark hidden until the day he could reveal himself and claim his crown. These narratives transformed historical trauma into a manageable story. They allowed a conquered people to process their loss not as a final defeat, but as a temporary setback in a much longer saga. The real child was replaced by a symbolic one, an immortal representation of national identity and lost glory who could never truly be defeated because they lived on in the stories people told by their firesides. This process of mythologization is not confined to the distant past. Modern conspiracy theories about the descendants of lost dynasties or secret bloodlines echo this very same human impulse. When the official record feels incomplete or untrustworthy, we still weave elaborate tales to explain the gaps, proving that the children of conquered kings live on, not in palaces or prisons, but in the endless landscape of our imagination. A knight's vow of chivalry could be a flickering candle in a very dark room. While power politics often dictated the harshest outcomes for royal children, a parallel system of ideals existed, one that offered a slender, often hypocritical, thread of protection. Across the medieval world, warrior codes like European chivalry, the Japanese Bushido, or Persian concepts of Jovanmadi created a framework for honorable conduct, even in victory. These were not enforceable laws, but powerful social contracts that shaped a leader's reputation. How a conqueror treated the captured women and children of a defeated rival became a public test of his virtue, a measure of whether he was a brute or a truly noble lord. The ideal demanded mercy for the vulnerable, arguing that true strength was demonstrated not in crushing the helpless, but in protecting them. We see this tension play out in the chronicles of the Crusades, albeit with glaring contradictions. During the Third Crusade, after the Siege of Acre, the situation was chaotic and brutal. Yet, chroniclers took care to note that Saladin, the Muslim leader, often showed clemency to captured women and children of rank, sometimes ransoming them or ensuring their safe passage. This was not just random kindness, it was a calculated part of his chivalric image, a tool of psychological warfare designed to portray him as a more civilized and magnanimous opponent than his European counterparts. On the European side, a knight was theoretically bound by his oath to defend the weak, which included high-born women and children caught in the storm of war. A famous, though likely romanticized, example involves Richard the Lionheart. The story goes that during the same campaign, when his forces captured a caravan, they discovered women of noble birth among the passengers. According to the tale, Richard, in a display of chivalric duty, ordered that they be protected and returned to Saladin's camp unharmed. Whether entirely true or not, the fact that such stories were celebrated and recorded reveals the power of the ideal. It set a standard against which a ruler's actions were judged, both by his contemporaries and by history. A conqueror who wantonly slaughtered children might secure his throne, but he risked being remembered as a tyrant and a monster, a reputation that could alienate potential allies and inspire future enemies. This appeal to honor could occasionally stay an executioner's hand. A bishop might intervene, reminding a king of his Christian duty to be merciful. A council of nobles might argue that sparing a young prince and placing him in a monastery would burnish the dynasty's legacy far more than a secret murder in the night. These codes created a crucial, if fragile, space for negotiation. They introduced a complicating factor into the cold calculus of power, forcing a victor to weigh immediate security against the lasting judgment of his honor. The treatment of the most vulnerable prisoners became a litmus test, a moment where the brutal reality of conquest briefly encountered the aspirational glow of a society's highest ideals. The grand narratives of kings and conquests often leave these stories untold, but the silenced nurseries of fallen dynasties hold the deepest secrets of power. We have journeyed through a shadow history where a child's fate was never a matter of chance, but a deliberate choice on a cold political spectrum. From the silent finality of the tower to the gilded cage of the palace, from the humiliating triumph to the strategic wedding altar, each path was a different tool for the same purpose: to secure a throne by managing the threat of a rival's blood. This is the ultimate revelation that power consolidates itself not only with the sword, but through the control of lineage, the systematic rewriting of identity, and the careful curation of memory. The next time you gaze upon a portrait of a triumphant emperor or walk through the ruins of a conquered palace, look beyond the obvious symbols of victory. Remember the human cost woven into the very fabric of that power, the children whose lives were the currency of empire. Their legacy challenges us to question the stories we are told and to listen for the echoes in the quietest rooms of history. We would love to hear which of these fates you find most compelling, so please share your thoughts below. And for more journeys into history's deepest mysteries, be sure to subscribe.